And this is part of the problem for science too, isn't it? I say this with the bias of someone who's married to a scientist, but there are fantastic stories in science, and scientists are usually the worst people to communicate those stories. So, I mean, this is not a happy ending story, but there is that problem, the disconnect between the research, and partly that research often tends to be necessarily qualified and partial and sceptical, and what we sort of see as the narratives and the stories and the sell, I guess, in a kind of advertising sense.
I think at this point scientists have basically done their job, and it's been a heroic job in this regard. I mean, in 20 years they've taken a problem of incredible dimension and complexity, and reduced it to an operable shared consensus, a robust understanding. The U.S., the National Academy of Sciences put out a paper today saying, for the umpteenth time, but with more fervor than usual, because we're having a sort of seasonal outbreak of kooky denialism underway, saying, look, our panels have looked at all of this and examined it from every direction, and the fact that humans are warming the planet is now settled science. Get over it, science has largely done its job, and it's up to the rest of us to take that. I mean, with rare exceptions, scientists are not the best spokesman for their science. It's just a different cast of mind that makes it hard to speak in, or just in a different vocabulary that makes it difficult for people to communicate. The things that are prized in one magisterium make little sense in others in a way. So on we push. But that's why it's great fun to get to work with people like Hansen. And the gratitude of scientists for this kind of work is very strong. They are usually acutely aware of their own limitations in this regard. And some of them are exceptionally brave. Hansen, we did this, my great writing guru, my favorite writer in the world, someone probably people don't know in Australia, the Kentucky farmer and essayist Wendell Berry, a great hero of mine. If you remember nothing else from this talk, remember that name and go check out his books. Barry and I, he's worked a lot on mountaintop removal, coal mining in his native Appalachia, and I've obviously worked on climate change. And last year we sent out a letter to people asking them to sort of open letters saying, come to Washington. The U.S. Congress operates its own power plant a few blocks from Capitol Hill to power itself, and for 113 years they've run it on coal, and that's long enough, and we're going to do civil disobedience to shut it down. So come with us. And 5,000 people showed up to get arrested. Hansen, the first person I heard back from was Jim Hansen saying, I'll be there and ready to go. And there were a lot of other scientists who did the same thing. And it was a spectacular day. The police said, we can't arrest you, there are too many. And it didn't matter, because halfway through the afternoon we got a letter from the leadership of the House and Senate saying, okay, we're going to convert this thing to natural gas inside of 6 months. And that doesn't solve the problem, but it cuts it in half.
I get something done.
And one down, 600 to go. But, it was a start. And it was I very much liked the literary, Wendell and I mean, we didn't do the logistical organizing, that was Greenpeace and some other groups, but that's where the call had come from. And in part, one of the reasons it was so successful was sort of interesting. What we said in the letter, we said, if you want to come participate, you can only do it if you come wearing your Sunday best, for two reasons. One, we were hoping to discourage people whose main joy would be taunting the police and whatever. And two, out of an sort of desire to make an almost visual point, we wanted to sort of try to demonstrate that that there's nothing radical at all about the point that we're trying to make. What's radical is dumping carbon in the atmosphere and just waiting to see what happens. You know, the most, you know, Karl Marx in his most radical day never thought of anything as radical as doubling the carbon content of the atmosphere, you know. And so we wanted to make very much the point of who the actual, in a sense, conservatives in this question are. And the fact that somehow, at least in America, conservatism has become identified with this sort of willingness to plunder the planet is the strangest and most damaging of political developments.
I want to talk a little bit about China. You can't talk about the world without talking about China. In maybe one, you talked about some of the ecological consequences of the one-child policy. And in Earth, you talk about China leading the world in terms of renewable energy, about villages, you know, generating their own energy with tiny biogas digesters. But on the other side of this coin, there's the sheer size of China's population, its aspirations, everything we in Australia know about how much coal we love them buying. Can you talk a little bit about some of the ironies and contradictions and some of the possibilities in terms of China and climate change?
I arrived 24 hours ago from China, so it's sort of fresh in my mind. As always, it's an overpowering place to visit and very hard to get a handle on. Its sheer scale makes it difficult. China's in a huge race between green energy and black energy, as it were. You know, one day I was in Inner Mongolia at the site of the biggest coal mine in the world, an endless parade of trucks driving away, carrying coal off to an endless array of power stations, and the high-tension lines fanning out across the countryside in all directions. The next day, I was at the newly under construction Solar Valley, 4 hours drive from Beijing in Dezhou, where Huang Ming, the leader of Hemin Solar, has taken technology developed in Australia. He was at the University of New South Wales, and when he couldn't find backing for it here, went to China and has become, I mean, there's nobody in the world who's produced more. He told me, what did he tell me yesterday? That they have 160 million square meters now installed of solar hot water heater in China, which means I think that more than half of the world's entire renewable energy capacity is hot water heaters on the roofs of Chinese homes. Okay? 250 million Chinese get their hot water from solar hot water heaters. So one of the biggest questions in the world is how China is going to break, in a sense, whether it's going to, whether green energy will be a fairly small complement to the coal-fired power at the heart, or whether they'll make the even larger investments necessary to make it the bulk. And the answer to that question depends more than anything on what the rest of the world decides. If the West decides that it's going to get serious about climate change, put a cap on carbon, a price on carbon, and all of that, then there's some hope that the Chinese will up their game even more. But we have no moral authority to tell them to do so. And at the moment, I think, among other things, they're afraid that the West is going to do nothing and that they better save some resources for dealing with the overwhelming effects of climate change, which are already being felt in China. You know, the country's drying up. And that's going to be, among other things, not just destabilizing, but incredibly expensive to deal with.
You live a very particular sort of life as a late 20th century, early 21st century writer. You get to fly to a lot of fantastic places and meet a lot of interesting
and
people.
I have a carbon footprint.
Your carbon footprint I don't want to talk about.
Astonishing, yeah.
You get to work in this particular way to cover lots of different stories. In maybe one, you wrote about the choice that you and your wife made to have just one child, and she's 17 now. What are the crucial differences, do you think, between the choices that you've been able to make in terms of how you live, how you work, what you do, and the choices that your daughter will be able to make in 5 years, in 15 years, in terms of her work, her life?
In some ways, I mean, the only part of, in some ways, we come closer to living a sustainable life than, at present, and except for this work that I do at 350, which requires me to be out around the world. But if I stop that, we've tried to build a life where we live that is, we live in a zero energy house, and our food comes from the neighborhood, and so on and so forth. And I think that some of that will be perfectly possible for Sophie. I don't think that in general we'll have recourse to the same kind of easy mobility around the planet that we do now. And I think compensating for that, we'll have to figure out other ways to do it, in essence. I think that the internet is one of the few good wild cards that we've developed in the last 20 years, and that it offers some real possibilities for living local lives that don't become parochial, for having a deeply local economic life, but an intellectual life that's very open to the rest of the world still. You can do, I think I put it in the book, you can do 1,000 Google searches for the amount of energy that it takes to drive a car a kilometer. Okay, so some of our travel is going to have to be done with the mouse from here on in. Frankly, my greatest hope in the entire world is to never get on an airplane again. And I would love very much to. We're trying very hard to. Well, it's not even a job, since I don't get paid for doing the 350 stuff, to work myself out of whatever this avocation is as quickly as possible.
And get back to being a writer.
Yes. Or just retire.
When you wrote End of Nature 20 years ago, I mean, the mythology of the dates when we started thinking about climate change, it was always, things that would happen in 2010, 2020, 2050. Those things are fairy tale figures, except that now we're here. So when you wrote End of Nature, what did you hope might have been achieved by 2010, and what did you expect?
My theory of political change, of when I wrote End of Nature when I was 26, 27, my theory of political change was I would write a book, people would read it, and then they would take care of the problem. Yes.
Great. So we would be done by 1992.
I thought, I'll have to find something else to write about soon. This will be dealt with. That I was naive to the ways of the world was, I'm afraid, altogether obvious.
Is it a strange thing as a writer to find yourself telling the same story for 20 years?
Yeah, I mean, the thing about climate, however, is that it's so big, this story, that there are 1,000 different ways to approach it. I've written extensively about communications and how our image of the world is formed. I've written a lot about places that are of interest, sort of hopeful. I've written about population. All these things are once you start pulling at this sweater, it unravels in many different directions. There's theological and psychological and sociological and economic implications of all that we're up to. So I've had enough to keep me busy without having to repeat myself, which has been good.
As I said earlier, I did emerge from reading Earth with a profound sense of possibility and a sort of optimism, which I have to say, as someone with both a small child and a fairly reckless imagination about possible futures for the world, that was a kind of relief. It is easy to sort of sink behind the size and the scale of things in terms of trying to understand the problems that are bound up and to feel paralysed by that. But so many organisms in our biota are just getting on with adapting. They don't have all the philosophical and ideological noise to deal with that we generate. Do you have a sense of optimism about the human potential to adapt?
I've largely given up trying to figure out whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic at any given moment. I just sort of get up in the morning and try to do what I can. The science is very grim, and it's happened much more quickly than we would have expected, and it continues to get grim day by day. But it's hard to remain pessimistic in light of the kind of political traction that we're finding, not in governments yet, but in this kind of movement building around the world. It's so beautiful and heartening to see, and to see people willing to, I went to, when I was organizing last year, I went to Bethlehem, a hard place even to get to because of all the military checkpoints and things, but I we did a great meeting there, and I was really curious to see what came of it. And on October 24th was in tears when the picture arrived. The Dead Sea is shrinking rapidly, and due as the climate warms, and so the Israeli activists formed a big, huge, giant 3 on their beach, giant human 3. The Palestinians a 5 on their beach. The Jordanians a 0 on their sector of the shore. That was really, things like that kept happening and keep happening all the time. And they make one hope, maybe against hope, that will rise to the occasion. It's going to be interesting. It's a test of whether the big brain was a good adaptation or not. It's gotten us in a lot of trouble, and now we'll find out whether in combination with the big heart, maybe more importantly, the big heart, we'll be able to get out of that trouble. And I maintain some faith that we will. If you were a betting person, you might bet that we won't. The odds, right now aren't very good, but that's not a bet you're allowed to make. And the clear moral imperative is to do what one can to change those odds. And I don't know whether, so I don't know what the outcome's going to look like, and so I sort of have given up thinking about it, but I do know that we can change the odds in significant ways, and given the stakes of the wager, changing the odds is well worth a lifetime's work.
It's an absolute privilege to be able to talk with you. I'm thrilled
Vice
that
versa.
someone has brought you to Australia to talk to people here. We have got some time, and I do want to let people have an opportunity to have a chat with Bill. Again, if you could make your questions brief, there are microphones moving around.
If all governments suddenly, magically fell in line and went ahead and did everything that we feel we need to do,
Yes.
how could we stop the natural tendency in the predators, the most predatorial of humans, to compete, to continue competing for growth and greed?
You can only do that if you're able to put, you probably can't stop among everyone in the time that we have anyway, that instinct. So what we're going to need to do is regulate economies in profound ways to try to push that competition in some direction that's useful. It's pretty clear that in the time that we have to deal with this, we're going to be dealing with markets, even if you could posit some different system in your head that might be better. It's pretty clear we're going to be dealing with the collection of, faiths that we have, even though it might be easier if we had all converted to some nature-based religion or something. Those aren't sort of on offer, so we're going to have to figure out how to use the tools that we have. And that means the heavy regulation of markets, precisely so that those animal instincts are channeled in useful directions. Job one for that is putting a stiff price on carbon to reflect the damage that it does in the environment. That's the only lever that we have to pull that's big enough to make a difference in the time that we have. And so we have to make it, we have to pull it hard. We have to put a stiff price on carbon. It won't be easy for the reasons that you emphasize.
There was a question, yep, just at the back there.
Could you imagine if the problems of peak oil would kick in big time in the next couple of years, that your favorite topic of climate change would become a little bit obsolete?
The question, if oil really peaks, will this solve the climate change problem or make it more obsolete? In a certain sense, of course, it would help by raising. I mean, the effect of peak oil is to raise the price of oil, and that helps drive us in a different direction, which is good. The problem is one of the directions at the moment that it's likely to drive us in the absence of a sort of stronger regulation of carbon, is in the direction of coal, of which we have a lot. You have altogether too much here in Australia. And if that becomes the substitute, then we'll be in trouble. So it doesn't, the kind of fact that we're beginning to run out of oil doesn't obviate the need to take real significant political action about fossil fuel in general.
Sorry, there was just a question further along here.
Yes, sir. Is this on?
Yes.
Yeah. In some way, you've gone to answer the question I was asking, which was just about our addiction to coal. I mean, one of the reasons that we live in such a beautiful city is because we have just so much coal and we're selling it so rapidly. And all of us in Australia, we're all addicted to it and addicted to selling it. I just wonder whether you had anything to say to us in this room.
It's very clear that we've got to get off coal. We're going to use most of the easily available petroleum that we can find. That's, I'm afraid, pretty clear. This stuff is so valuable, especially for transportation fuel and things, that we're just going to keep using it. The question becomes, and the mathematics is daunting, Hanson's team did a paper that said we basically have to be off coal as a world by 2030. And we have to forego the unconventional oils, the tar sands, the oil shales, the absurdly deep water formations that we're finding out about in the Gulf of Mexico at the moment, on and on and on. We'll have to forego all of those temptations. And there are always going to be temptations. The trouble with coal is it's so cheap and easy to get at. And it always will be. And, or at least for the next 100 years, which is the relevant period. And so it will be forever a painful choice to forego it, or at least for a while. It is striking that Australia, the difficulty that Australia's had, you're the only place in the world that elected a prime minister more or less in an election fought on climate change. And that nothing's happened is it's a testimony to the power of fossil fuel. It sort of makes the point, it's one of the reasons that we're so big on organizing globally. It's very difficult to do this one place at a time. In a certain sense, the leaders of the biggest and most important countries are going to have to hold hands and jump at once to kind of make it happen. And Australia and Australians need to play a role very much pushing their own governments, but also joining that international. The thing that was really damaging about Rudd's decision to stand down was not just the effect it'll have on the carbon emissions from Australia over the years, but it was also a sort of signal to other leaders around the world that this stuff is too hot to touch, even if you were elected on the explicit promise to do something about it. And so that's the reason we got to keep building movements here and everywhere. And a lot of that work has to be done locally and politically, but you got to save a little bit of your effort for helping us on this global scale too, because that'll make all the things at home a lot easier if we're able to make progress there.
There's a question just at the back here. I'm sorry, I couldn't see the gentleman before. Yep.
It's a question about leadership. You've just touched on it now, but I see that our predicament is really as a result of a chronic failure of leadership worldwide across all levels. So the question is, what is the holy grail, in your opinion, that we can use to change the minds of corporate leaders, political leaders, at the highest level? Because if that doesn't happen, if we don't go for the big stuff, that stiff carbon price that you're speaking of, then nothing else really matters.
There's no secret, I'm afraid. There's no secret answer to that question. If there were, we would have put it in place. There's only the answer that there always is, which is to organize enough political pressure and power. And we can only, look, ExxonMobil made more money last year than any company in the history of money, okay? My prediction is we're not going to compete in monetary terms with the influence that fossil fuels are able to bring to the table. That leaves us relatively few options. The only one that I can really think of is in terms of bodies and passion and spirit. We got to keep building these. So the last day of Copenhagen, okay, I was in a very bad mood because Copenhagen had been a big failure. The world had teed up this problem, everybody was there, and then we just whiffed. We didn't do anything. And it was a good thing that we brought with us to Copenhagen the largest delegation in the world, 350, as it were, young people from around the planet. Good because they did a great job there in those 2 weeks, and good for me on that last day because they kept coming up to me and saying one way or another. And remember, these are people who mostly coming from poor countries where power is somewhat more naked in its... they kept saying, look, we didn't expect to win in a year. That's how long we've been organizing. We're up against the most profitable thing humans do. And so we're going to have to go back and organize and get bigger and stronger and see if we can take them on again. And I'm afraid that there's no shortcut, that's what has to happen. So tell everybody you know about this 10-10-10 Day of Action at 350.org. That's the next date on the calendar where we have a chance to push the system some and see what results. And one of the reasons we organize the way that we do is one of the things that has to happen is there has to be a consistent meme, a consistent idea, in this case a consistent number going out all over the world so that there's enough pressure building behind one idea to get it across. And one of the great pleasures of the kind of organizing we've been doing for the last couple of years is that we haven't built an organization. We still have, is evidenced by the fact that we don't even, I'm sort of unpaid. We basically have almost no staff. What we do have is great connections now into organizations the world over, environmental and other organizations, who are willing to set aside some of their own agenda on occasion for a little while to join together in a large campaign. And we need everybody's help in making that happen.
I'm conscious that there are people who need to get to other sessions. I'm sorry that there were a lot of questions that weren't able to be asked, but I do think that our time with Bill McKibben has come to an end. I would really urge you all to read this book. It is by turns quite shocking and quite empowering. My husband teaches a course on biological adaptation to climate change, so I can't get away from thinking or talking about this ever. And he has a nice line for his students about there being more energy in the system now. He talks about, the balance that used to exist between the radiation that reached Earth, the radiation that bounced off it, how it's out of whack. That means, levels of entropy are higher, everything's a bit more unpredictable, a little bit less stable, and so the climate is changing as the system tries to equalise. I really like that line about more energy in the system, not just in terms of thinking about what we're dealing with, but in terms about thinking of that line as a metaphor for all of us. Because if we're energetic in how we respond to our new Earth, how we adapt, how we engage with it, how we make decisions within its new parameters, then maybe the cumulative effects of all of that might just live up to the old adage of something being more than the sum of its parts, and that's probably the best thing that we can hope for. I would like to thank you all very much for coming today. Thanks to Bill McKibben for his incredibly generous and interesting conversation. Thank you very much. Thank you.